All right. Well, thanks for joining me. I'm Carl Youngblood, and I'm here with my friend Rafael Lopez, who works at AWS and has a lot of experience here, and I used to be there as well. And today, Raf and I are going to be working on setting up a static website to be hosted from S3 and CloudFront. Now, why might you want to do that? S3 is great for storing static objects, but sometimes you want your content distributed more broadly in a way that is closer to the person that's browsing your website. And that's where a content distribution network comes in, or CDN. And CloudFront is an excellent content distribution network that will take your static assets, spread them to servers all around the globe, and always serve them from places that are in very close proximity to your visitors of your website so that they will see the content quickly with lower latency. Thanks for being here with me, Rafael.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right, so what are we going to do first then to set this up?
So the elements we are going to need is, of course, the S3 bucket. I would start from there because
Okay.
the bucket is the logical storage unit that you will have your website. In this case, it's a static website, so you would like to create a bucket. You can create that bucket in an AWS region that is closer to you. Buckets are regional, and you can choose that when you create the bucket. So you can choose the option create bucket and then put a bucket name in
So
there.
for this bucket, I'm going to serve this from a domain name that I control, and I typically follow the convention of naming my buckets according to the subdomain that they're going to be served from.
Yeah, that's a good convention. Now, one consideration, you will only be using this bucket to store your data because the data will be served by CloudFront, right?
That's right.
So the prices of AWS services, they vary per region. And the region that has the lowest prices is US East 1. In the case of S3, it's the price per size, the amount of objects, like how many gigabytes, petabytes you will be hosting. I know Virginia has good prices because you're going to distribute that over CloudFront. Latency is not that much of a concern, and it has better prices.
And the idea there is that any content that gets requested that's already available in the cache will be served by CloudFront instead of directly from the bucket. So even though we get good pricing on buckets that are in Virginia, the fact is, after the content gets cached in the CloudFront distribution, it will mostly be serving from CloudFront.
Yeah,
right?
And the data transfer out from S3 to CloudFront is 0.
Awesome.
So you're not paying bandwidth twice.
That's great.
It would make sense to choose a bucket that is closer to your users if you would be serving content straight out from the bucket, not using CloudFront.
Right. It's hard to decide on which bucket is closest, right? Because there's people all over the place, right?
Yeah, but for example, if you were a bank operating in Singapore, right?
Gotcha.
You could choose a bucket, in Singapore. But again, if you were serving content straight out of the bucket. Okay, bucket name, region, Virginia.
Yeah, so we have some settings here. Now, one thing that I want to just mention is that we are able to design this and configure it in a way that we don't need to just enable access to the bucket directly. And so I'm going to leave this box checked here that says to block all public access, because we're going to give the CloudFront distribution special access to the bucket.
Perfect.
Is there anything else I should change here?
No, you can leave everything on the defaults.
Okay.
Create
I'm going
bucket.
to go ahead and create it. So we've created our bucket. And is there any change that I should make to the bucket configuration first, or should I do something else next?
No, you can open the bucket and upload your index.html or whatever file you want to serve.
Excellent. So I happen to have a file ready to go, and it's a very basic file. There we go, index.html, and then upload.
Okay.
So it's there.
Now you are paying for 89 bytes.
Yeah. Fortunately, it's very inexpensive.
Yeah, it's 0.0000 something dollars. You can close that. Now we have an S3 bucket created with a file inside. We call that an object, S3. So we are now ready to create the CloudFront distribution. I noticed that the bucket is not public. The bucket is private because, as Carl said, we are going to give a special permission from CloudFront to the bucket. But first, let's create the distribution.
All right, so we're going to create the distribution, and we need to tell it where to get its content from. We're going to refer it to the bucket that we just created, and we want to use this origin access control settings, which is the new recommended way. So we're going to need to update the buckets policy in order to do this, and CloudFront will tell us what to put in there as soon as we complete this process.
Yeah, but
So
you have to create the controls. You have to either select one origin access control that you should have previously created. Yeah, just click there and create control setting. It will on the fly create it for you.
Yep.
Just click create. Yeah, it will create and fill up that box.
Yeah, now this is interesting. Just speaking of user experience on this page, my initial reading of what this tree view was doing
is that it drills down from legacy access identity.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
exactly. And so that was a little confusing to me because I thought that this setting here only applied if I had selected
subsection
legacy.
of legacy. I agree with you.
Yeah, but that's not the case. This applies to this entire radio control, which is all three options.
Except for the public. Because if it's public, then
it will disable that.
So,
yeah. Okay, anyway, so we're going to scroll down. I think everything else can stay the same.
You can redirect HTTP to HTTPS.
All right, we'll go ahead and do that. Obviously, that won't work until we have our certificate enabled.
We can do that just while we are building the CloudFront distribution. And I like to call CloudFront the coffee front or tea front because you do a little configuration, go drink a coffee because it's going to take 5 minutes. So if you hit create distribution, it's going to take you minutes to apply that configuration. That's the tea front. Let's get our just.
So while we're waiting for that to propagate, why don't we go ahead and copy this policy
and go to the bucket to update?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So S3 buckets, they have something called a bucket policy, which is a permission mechanism defined by a JSON document that defines who can access what inside an S3 bucket. And what Carl is going to do now, he's going to the permissions tab and edit the bucket policy and paste that JSON document he copied from the CloudFront console. So
we've edited the bucket policy. We could go back to CloudFront to see how it's proceeding with the propagation.
It's ready now. So yeah, try accessing that URL and you're going to have an error.
And we are missing the request for the actual file, the index.html file.
If you append the /index.html, it should work.
Let's see what happens when we do that. Hey, it worked.
Cool. Now, let's show our audience a way to do that automatically.
So I've gone back to the distribution and I'm editing the distro rule, and there's a default root object here. If I just put index.html in there, that should, if the user fails to specify index.html on the URL itself, that should automatically redirect them there. The next step after doing that would be to then be able to serve my website from a slightly more user-friendly domain than this gobbledygook right there, right? For that, we're going to need to have a domain, which I have registered already, and we also need to generate a certificate for that domain. The first thing we want to do is generate the certificate, because I know I've got the domain already ready. If I hadn't registered the domain, we would do that first. But let's go to Certificate Manager, and let's request a new certificate. And this certificate, I'm going to do a wildcard domain so that anything from my personal domain, any subdomain, will be supported. All the other settings I can leave as is. I'm going to hit request. And if I go into this, there's just some settings that need to be added to my Route 53, a CNAME setting that needs to go in there. I'm going to request that it do this, that it create the records for me, because this domain is hosted with AWS already. and it's already done. So now I do have the certificate request has been approved. And now I can go back to the CloudFront distribution. So let's go to CloudFront. So I'm going to select this certificate as the one I want to serve from. And I also need to change the CNAME setting, but that CNAME, does that need to exist? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I can add that after.
Yeah, let's try, because before adding a CNAME, you gotta have a certificate. So let's see if it will complain. Otherwise, you'll first save the certificate and then add. Oh, perfect.
That
It worked.
worked.
Cool.
All right, so the last setting then would be to go to Route 53 again and add the alias in my DNS. So if I go to hosted zones here, go to my domain and create a record. I'm going to call this test, make it an alias, and choose a
Your
CloudFront
cloud.
distribution. And it gives me that option. And now I'm going to create that record. And as soon as the CloudFront distro is all ready to go, let's go back to CloudFront and wait for that to.
Without the index.html. There you go.
Hey, it worked. And it's served up at SSL. If we check on certificate is valid, you can see that the certificate has been issued by Amazon. So that's showing that the AWS certificate manager generated cert is the one that's being served up now. So deployed a static website, distributed it over CloudFront using an S3 bucket, and done it all securely. Thanks again, Ruff, for all your help today.
Yes, my pleasure. I hope you learned something today.
Definitely. I certainly did.